Politics and International Relations Roundtable. One of the things we've done as the journal, since we took over as a team based at Queen's University in Belfast and Newcastle, is encourage submissions on elections, on party politics, electoral politics. Very much like to continue in this theme, and in this regard we've decided to have a roundtable as we do every PSA on the topic of the general election. We've got an esteemed panel with us today, 4 esteemed scholars on various aspects of party politics and electoral politics. We're basically going to talk in the order in the programme, starting Professor Kees van der Eyck from Nottingham University in British Election Study, followed by Professor Justin Fisher from Brunel University in the Constituency Campaigning Research Study, followed by John Tong from Liverpool, who's going to talk to us a bit about the general election in general and also the Northern Irish election study, and finally Meryl Kenny from Leicester, who's the chair of the PSA's Women in Politics specialist group. Talk for about 15 minutes each and then we'll open it for questions. Okay, thank you. Kees.
Okay, thank you for this invitation. I will do this without PowerPoint. Point it hopefully out of your and my way. Does it work or not? Oh, that's good. Anyway, I'll do this without PowerPoint.
Sorry, you have a microphone.
Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Good. As I said, I'll do this without PowerPoint, partly because I've been thinking a long time about what to say, and I was a bit afraid that a number of things that I might prepare on PowerPoint might already have been covered by another roundtable today, which took place this morning with the eminent contributions of Rob Ford and John Curtis. And of course, being involved in the British election study, there are all kinds of things that I could talk about. But I was somewhat correct in my apprehension that a number of those things were already covered by both Rob and John. So I decided to talk about a number of other things, namely a number of things that they left kind of untouched. So what do we see in all the polls, all the predictions for what will happen on May the 7th? Most likely a hung parliament, most likely more votes, at least in terms of share of the votes, for third parties, which are now third, fourth, fifth and sixth parties. If we look at survey data, we will see a number of other things too, which probably contribute to this, as particularly related to by John Curtis this morning, declining strength of party identification, a lack of enthusiasm about many of the major parties, and things like that. So also we cannot really expect a huge increase in turnout if we can go by way of the current polls. So declining strength of party identification, greater willingness to support third parties, lack of mobilization. Where does all this come from? And the question was asked this morning in terms of whether or not the mold was broken, and the mold was then the Westminster model that at one time, now 1.5 century ago, encapsulated almost all the voters into voting for either Labour or Conservative in shares of the vote of in excess of 90%, with hardly any other, not none, but hardly any other parties on the ballot. And so why did that change? And I think actually that's an interesting question to look at, even when we are interested in what happens on May 7th. But whatever we will see in May 7th is to some extent dependent upon what we compare it with. And I want to take here a perspective on the long development. Now, so why did the Westminster system, as it might have existed at some moment in more or less ideal form, break down? Well, because it was a system. And every system, whatever social system or natural system we talk about, is subject to a tendency towards entropy. Entropy is disorder. And a system is the opposite. A system is something that is structured in a very particular way. And entropy is the natural development of every system going towards disorder. So in a way, looking at the heyday of the Westminster system in the 1950s, we could say that was an unsustainable system unless a lot of energy, or some people call it information, or in politics we might call it power, has been invested in shoring it up. Only then will you keep entropy at bay, by investing in it. And in a number of ways, those factors that could have shored up this system failed to keep entropy at bay. And there are two factors that I want to focus on in particular. One is with respect to the citizens, and the other is with respect to the institutions. First, when we look at citizens, what is it that shores up a system, that shores up that people behave according to such a very rigid mold? Well, one of the most important things is socialization into partisanship. Socialization into partisanship for only two parties, not for other parties. And so my perspective is that this socialization has gradually been eroded for a number of reasons, which most extensively have been written down now about 20 years ago in a volume by Franklin, Mackey and Valen, which is called Electoral Change. And in that volume they look at the number of European and non-European countries and investigate electoral change. And in the last chapter I had the privilege of joining the main authors of the book in trying to make sense out of why all kinds of systems seem to have gone on the slide, whether it is in the US, whether it's in continental Europe, and whether it is in Britain. It's called sometimes differently in different systems. It's called the decline of class voting in Britain. It's called the decline of consociationalism in the Netherlands, and so on. But we position that there is maybe a single process underlying all of that. And that process is that the socialization of new citizens, of new generations, into allegiance with these existing parties is failing. Why? Well, these parties had their origins in important social conflicts and divides in an earlier era when party systems were formed. Those conflicts and divides have to some extent been solved, well, not with a capital S, but solved, ameliorated, by policy, which was in a number of ways successful, including things like the development of the welfare state and all kinds of other things. And by that, to some extent, by having successful policies, in some way it took away some of the steam that drives successful socialization of new generations into the patterns of their elders. And so, in a way, you could say it's the success of a number of democratic policies in the 30s and 40s that undermine the strength of socialization into consistent partisan allegiances with the existing system of newer generations. And those newer generations later on, of course, get their offspring seeing adulthood, and that declines further. And after a number of generations, the strength of socialization into the partisanship of the existing parties has declined sufficiently to have become qualitatively different. So that's one of the reasons, I think, why we see over the course of 50 some years, or maybe 60 years if we look at the entire length of the British election study and its previous incarnations, then why we see this set of changes of greater appetite for third-party voting, declining party identification, declining mobilization, and so on. This socialization deficit, if you want to call it that way, that is there and therefore was not able to shore up the existing system and contributes to entropy, leads therefore to a number of consequences. Not only that as people feel affiliated to one of the major parties, not only that they are more inclined to give a favorable look at new parties, but also that they are less fired up about any kind of partisanship whatsoever. And that contributes to the declining engagement, electoral engagement of citizens in elections. But at the same time, the party system reacts to a changing electorate. And one of the changes that we have seen is a change in party supply. Now, not party supply so much in terms of which parties are on the ballot, but what the persistent names on the ballot represent. So New Labour is not the same as Labour a couple of decades ago. The Conservatives are maybe not exactly the same as they were before, and so on. And in this change of party supply, what we generally see is what you could call depolarization. In a recent article in the sister journal of the BJPIR, Political Studies, last January, so January of this year, Brandenburg and Jones have an analysis of the extent to which the lack of polarization, the lack of differences between the major parties leads to disengagement and drives also a lot of voters away from the existing parties. So basically what we see is that in the reply, the response of parties to a changing electorate, they overshot the mark in kind of a tendency towards catch-allism, in a tendency to focus more on valence than on policy position and ideological differences and all of that. And some of the consequences we see therefore reflected, not only in the polls, but probably also in what will happen on May the 7th. Another consequence of this declining linkage, if you want to call it that way, of the electorate with the traditional existing parties is not only that people are more favorably inclined towards upstarts and new political parties, but also that they are holding less exclusive preferences. It is not that if somebody likes a Labour Party as an electoral option and is highly enamored of that, that's the only thing that he or she likes. That might very well be in combination with an equally strong or almost equally strong preference for other parties. And what we see therefore is a strong increase in the number of people who hold very strong electoral preferences for at least two parties at the same time. In the late 1980s, we started monitoring this, and then there were about 30% of the British electorate who held equally strong electoral preferences for at least two parties. By now this has increased to 50%. Which means that for 50% of the electorate, there are two options which are, for all practical purposes, equally attractive. Under those circumstances, it's not a surprise that it is quite possible for all kinds of events to make them switch from one to the other without this having to be interpreted as really a change in preference. It looks to us like a change in preference, but for all practical purposes, for the citizens, it's a matter of choosing between two things which are equally good. Well, at the same time, of course, they have rejected the other options. I don't know of really any sizable percentage of people who have more than two parties at the same time at a high level of preference. But if you have two parties that are equally attractive, then in most instances this is one of the traditional major parties, either Labour or Conservative, and one of the other parties, which might be the Liberal Democrat, might be the Greens, might be UKIP, or whatever. And of course, then in Scotland and Wales, we have the nationalist parties as well entering the fray. These developments therefore have undermined the Westminster system and have contributed to its demise in a way, falling prey to entropy, and giving rise to another system. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there's another development that also has brought in entropy and has undermined the Westminster system, and that has to do with institutions. In a way you might say, that's strange. What institutions have changed? Well, of course we've had devolution, as was also in the Roundtable this morning being alluded to as an important factor that changes the mold of British politics. But there are more institutions than only that, and sometimes we forget about. Since 1979, there are direct elections to the European Parliament. Who cares? Well, that's exactly why they are important. Who cares? Most of the political parties do not care, which is shown by the extent to which they invest in campaigning and in mobilizing and in convincing voters to vote for them. But as a consequence, European elections are a breeding ground for new parties. And this is not only the case in Britain, it's seen all over Europe, in other countries as well, which take part in elections for the European Parliament. And in a cumulative way, this has two effects. On the one hand, it's a breeding ground for new parties, but it's also a context in which citizens become accustomed to and socialize themselves by habituation into voting for other parties, even if in Westminster elections they might still stay with the major two. Cumulatively, from 1979 onwards, this has been an important degrading factor of the Westminster system. It has been, its manifestations have been kept at bay for a long time, and maybe still even through this year, by the first past the post electoral system that governs Westminster elections. But at the same time, the system has been eroded tremendously and given way to these forces of entropy. So my long-term perspective is the old system, the Westminster system, was not sustainable unless there was really heavy investment in it. On the short run, for no political actor, there seemed to be a reason to put those investment in it, and therefore entropy took hold of it. By way of lacking strength of socialization, by way of institutional change, particularly by way of European Parliament elections. Consequences of that are an increasing propensity of an increasing number of people to hold multiple electoral preferences in conjunction with each other. That also makes for greater possibilities for volatility. So, and finally, it also leads to a considerable number of people who, by the depolarization of the major parties, are not really satisfied with anything on offer, sometimes not even the newcomers. In the British election study, we have a set of questions which ask people how attractive each of the parties is as an option to vote for, and that goes on a scale from 0 to 10. And we know from both British and European research that scores below 8 are actually indicating a sensible degree of disaffection. Now, there is no less than 30% of the British electorate who does not see any of the parties at the moment as a really attractive option, giving it at best a 7 on this scale of 0 to 10, and quite often lower. That's the best of all of them. Well, of course, to some extent we will not see these people because they will not turn out to vote. But it does present a reservoir for further party attempts to mobilize them, as UKIP has done to some extent with a particular segment of that electorate. Now, it might very well be that on May 7, the stranglehold to some extent of the two major parties on the lower house will be renewed. It might even be, although not very likely, that it might be an outright majority for either of those two. That does not mean that this tendency to the erosion, the further erosion of the Westminster system has been halted. It may be delayed, it may be arrested because of the first past the post system, but the genie cannot be put back in the bottle again.
Thanks very much, Kees. And now we move to Justin Fisher, who's going to talk because of the campaigning element.
Okay, can you hear me? Good. So I'm going to talk about campaigning, but in the context of something slightly bigger in terms of party finance. Great, okay, so I've titled my talk Past, Present, Future, and there are three things I want to reflect on. Just in terms of party finance, what I say, where we were then and where we are now, then looking at how this fits into campaigning, talking about money in elections, and then concluding by suggesting that post-election, significant reform in party finance may be more likely than it's ever been before. Okay, so just some data. This is central party income for the big three political parties from '89. That's the first set of accounts that where the Liberal Democrats were in being, and then the Conservative and Labour Party. And you can get a better idea of how things have worked if we smooth the data. So what we find is that for the first period of this graph, the Conservatives had what we would call their natural position, their normal position, as the party that was better funded. But as in so many aspects of Labour Party, things were much better for them when Tony Blair was leader, and we saw a real change with Blair at the helm and Labour becoming the wealthy party. Almost as soon as Blair went, the Conservatives restored their mantle as the wealthy party. Now, if you look at the graph here, you might say, well, okay, but that's changed again with Labour back on top. Now, this is because this takes us only up to the end of 2013. The 2014 accounts aren't out yet. And one of the features of British party finance, and one of the problems with British party finance, is it's driven almost completely by the general election cycle. So what happens is that parties are well funded at election time. In fact, raising money for elections is relatively straightforward. But the real problems come in the period the first 2 or 3 years after an election, where it's much more difficult for parties to raise money. And indeed, that's when you get the sorts of episodes that give party finance a bad name. So, in order to get a better picture of where we are now, we can look at the data on declared donations to the parties up to the end of 2014. The first quarter data for 2015 are not yet out. There's two charts here. The first is just declared cash donations to the central party. That one's on the left. The second one includes the public funding that parties receive. Now, most of that goes to the Labour Party because of their receipt of short money and Cranbourne money, of course, but the other two main parties get a little bit through the Policy Development Fund. But what's very clear is that in the run-up to the 2015 general election, the Conservatives have once again reasserted their financial muscle and have raised really quite a lot of money. So 25 million in declared cash donations, that's anything over 7.5k at national level, has been generated by the Conservative Party, and we would expect a considerable sum based on 2010 figures to be raised in the first 3 months of this year. If we go back to 2010, the Conservatives managed to raise 20 million in just 2 quarters alone in the run-up to the election. The Conservatives' financial muscle is really illustrated if we look at the last quarter of 2014, where you can see they raised something around £7 million in declared cash donations against only around 2.5 for Labour and just shy of 2 million for the Liberal Democrats. So the Conservatives are very much in the driving seat financially. However, this leads me to our second question about money in elections. And in fact, the relationship between money and elections has changed quite significantly over the last 20 or so years. The first reason for that And it's something I find myself correcting people on a great deal of the time. They always say, this is going to be the most expensive election ever. And in actual fact, over the last 4 elections, it will in fact probably be the cheapest. And the reason for that is that the national spending limits that were installed through the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act are a function of the number of candidates you put up, multiplied by £30,000. So if you stood in all 632 seats in Great Britain, and in reality 631 because you wouldn't stand in the seat of the Speaker, you could spend just shy of £19 million. But the problem is that that figure of £30,000 in the 2000 Act has never been adjusted for inflation. And so that national spending limit is now worth about 1/3 less than it was. So in real terms, the spending limit has come down to around £13 million. So national campaign spending is actually, over time, getting rather cheaper. And if we compare that with what's happening at constituency level, where it's candidates rather than party spending, and candidates can now spend much more because of an act passed in 2009, the imaginatively titled Political Parties and Elections Act, which created 2 spending periods, what we call the long campaign and the short campaign. And what this was designed to do was to put a stop to what particularly Labour MPs feared, was that the Conservative candidates were spending a great deal of money in the pre-regulated period, i.e. before the dissolution of Parliament. And so we had a creation in effect of a 4-month period, which in 2010 went back to January the 1st. For 2015, regulated spending for candidates went back to December the 18th, 2014. And then we have the short campaign, which has just kicked off at the moment the Queen dissolved Parliament yesterday. Now that means that in previous elections, candidates could spend around 12.5k on average. It varies by whether you're an urban rural seat and the size of the electorate. But now the level that you can spend in constituencies has gone up significantly, and it's potentially candidates could spend up to £40,000. So in that respect, elections are getting more expensive, at least at constituency level. Now, this throws up the question of whether money can buy votes. And the answer to that question is decidedly mixed. If we take national level spending, the only real way you can measure this over time is to look at the poll ratings over time and compare that with the level of spending over time. Because of course before 2000 there was no spending that was simply devoted to campaigning, it was just general expenditure. And tests that have been done on that suggest there are very few examples where national spending appears to improve national poll standing. In a 35-year study I conducted some years ago now, there was only one circumstance, and that was when the Conservative Party was the incumbent party, and even then it was very much on the cusp of statistical significance. In other words, you had to spend an absolute fortune in order to get around a half-point advantage. Now, part of the reason for that is the growing importance of constituency campaigning. In articles we've written in the past, we've suggested that in fact the national campaign has become subservient to the constituency campaign. In other words, what matters is the campaign on the ground in the constituencies, particularly in target seats, which all of the parties have got better at focusing on. Typically, Labour and the Liberal Democrats have been very good at this, but the Conservatives have now caught up in earnest, principally due to the input of Lord Ashcroft, who's made a real difference to the Conservative Party. Now, if you look at the work of Ron Johnson and Charles Patty, you'll know that there is consistent evidence that candidates who spend more, spend closer to the maximum they're permitted, tend to gain an electoral advantage, particularly if they're challengers. And that reflects the work that Gary Jacobson has done in the United States, looking at congressional elections. So on the face of it, there might be an argument to say that money can buy votes under certain circumstances. But in fact, the picture is a lot more complex. Because Campaigning, particularly at constituency level, is not only about spending, it's also about free voluntary effort. The sort of activity that goes on by supporters and members around the country, knocking on doors, sitting at polling stations, delivering leaflets, etc., etc. And for the last election, we decided to test this, to test the comparative impact of what we call free campaigning, stuff that didn't cost the candidates a dime, against the amount of money that they spent. And what we found was that not only can free campaigning offset financial advantage, it can on occasions actually deliver a greater electoral advantage than spending money. We see this through a simulation exercise that we conducted, where we looked at what would happen if each of the three principal parties spent the maximum they were permitted over the long and short campaign combined, and the other two parties spent very little. And we then compared what would happen if each of the three parties campaigned to the maximum level compared with their most intense campaigns of free campaigning, the maximum level of free campaigning, and the other parties did very little. So there are some estimations of seats that would have been won in 2010 on the table here. And the two I want you to draw your attention to are the ones in red. So in terms of spending, had the Conservatives spent the full amount, candidates spent the full amount, and the other party spent very little, they would have ended up with 344 seats, enough for a comfortable majority. But if we do the same experiment with free campaigning, we find that actually, had Labour done as much free campaigning as in their intense seats all across the country, Labour would have won 350 seats. In other words, just because you have money doesn't mean it will deliver electoral payoffs consistently all of the time. Which brings me to the final point, and that is why party finance reform is more likely now, or now more likely I should say. I'll preface that with a comparative argument about when big change in party finance is likely to occur, what I call circumstances for change. And the first is drawing on the literature from normative institutionalism, what we call a significant breakdown in the logic of appropriateness. Now what this reflects is the fact that what defines a scandal, what defines unacceptable behaviour, varies from country to country. We get in a terrible lather in this country about certain misdemeanours by politicians which wouldn't even register on a scale in countries just over the channel or in other parts of continental Europe. So it's the logic of appropriateness in a particular country that matters, not necessarily what the nature of the misdemeanour is. And it's true to say that in Britain, in fact, our level of genuine scandal in party finance is remarkably low. Secondly, we found over time, comparatively, that who is in the policy community determining party finance policy makes a difference. And if you get changes in the resources of that policy community, i.e. if new people enter the policy community or some actors become more powerful, then you're more likely to get change. So possibly after the election, we may have a Labour minority, possibly, very unlikely, a Labour majority, or a Labour coalition of some description. Thirdly, we can track what we call gradual evolutionary change. This is where the old systems, and to link up with Casey's point here, start to break down. Break down in formal party membership and fundraising. So in our work on the 2010 campaigns, we found, for example, that parties were relying quite significantly on people for their campaigning who weren't actually party members. People getting involved because they liked getting involved in a campaign, didn't want to go to lots of meetings, and certainly didn't want to make any donations. Now, if that continues, and we're going to measure more of that in our constituency study this time, that sort of thing threatens fundraising. As does the fact that fundraising for parties in a voluntary system is a huge collective action problem. We'll benefit from parties, but nobody wants to stick their hand in their pocket. And for those who do make donations, their motivations are always challenged. So that may well break down. The rising costs of politics. Our national elections are getting cheaper in real terms, but we're having more elections. We have a major set of elections in every single year, and parties need to exist as organisations rather than empty shells. And the problem is that the funding cycle goes with the general election cycle, whereas the expenditure needs of parties are pretty constant. And then rising disparities of income. Declining functionality of existing rules, which I'll come back to, and then the principal point I want to make, the legacy that Ed Miliband may have, is that what we've seen since the last election is the removal of a barrier for change, which may create an incentive for reform. Now, those of you who follow party finance will know that in the last few years there have been two major reviews of party finance, the Phillips Review and the Committee on Standards in Public Life Review. Both of those were rejected in part because they challenged the way in which Labour was funded by unions. If there were going to be donation caps, that would threaten the collective nature, it was argued, of Labour funding. But in the wake of the Falkirk row, as you'll recall, there were accusations that Unite was trying to fix the contest. Ed Miliband has effectively endorsed the very radical solution promoted by the Committee on Standards in Public Life. That is, that trade union members in affiliated trade unions should now contract into the political fund rather than contract out, and they should make a positive decision to give part of that money to the Labour Party. And this removes a major stumbling block to any future discussions, because Labour can no longer object to caps on donations because it won't affect trade union payments. So, just to conclude, I think that we may well be moving into a situation when reform of party finance is more likely. It's possible we will have a change of government. It's decidedly possible that the existing rules will have declining functionality, particularly corporate donations. At the moment, we ban money from outside the United Kingdom, but that's increasingly difficult to do if you have corporate donations. It's very difficult to determine what is a British company. We may have a genuine scandal, such as MPs' expenses, rather than just a mere episode. But perhaps the removal of the key barrier is the most important thing, the reforms of Ed Miliband. And so, to sign off, it may be that a drunken brawl in the House of Commons may change party finance forever.
Thanks, Justin. Now we move to John Tom.
Okay, I want to talk about 15 minutes. I want to talk about half of those 15 minutes about the election in Northern Ireland, but I just want to start off with a few sort of general observations about the election campaign so far. I think that what has really struck me is how defensive the Conservative election campaign has been thus far, given they have a pretty reasonable economic narrative to offer in terms of falling unemployment, low inflation, economic growth. And yet the defensiveness is pretty evident. If you look at what some of Cameron's senior advisors have been saying, I quote one, this is about A, concentrating upon the economy, and secondly, there must be no effort spared to avoid, as they put it, demuppetizing Ed Miliband. And that really is the two strands of the campaign thus far. It's surprising. Why should the economy be the single focus of the Conservative Party's achievements? Well, I think part of the problem lies in the fact that it's difficult for the Conservatives to trumpet some of their non-economic achievements because they don't necessarily play that well with sections of the electorate. If you think about which section of the... Think about there's been Conservative spending increases. The commitment to the world's poorest, for example, doesn't play well with the electorate. The implementation of same-sex marriage, again, doesn't play well with a section of the Conservative inclined electorate. fights with the police over their pay and perks. Again, difficult for the Conservatives to trumpet that particular achievement. The only time I've heard David Cameron get emotional thus far in this early stage of the campaign is when he made that speech where he said, look at the children you love and do you want to saddle them with debt? Well, when I look at the children I love, I certainly think about debt and financial catastrophe. I also think about that I'm not getting child benefit for them anymore. But the point about the campaign for the Conservatives is that it's it's such a defensive strategy that I think they're going to have to come up with a slight revision of it rather than simply banging on the economic narrative because it's not working. Of course, there is a section of the commentariat that does believe that there's a shy Conservative electorate out there that is not telling pollsters the truth. I think that was most evident in Matthew Parris's commentary, I think it was last week in the Times, where he said the Conservatives will win and win well. Who knows? In terms of Labour's strategy, I actually, on Monday, had a bet with Coral, a fairly substantial bet, on Ed Miliband to be the next Prime Minister. It took 9-4. Who will be the question was, who will be the Prime Minister on the 1st of June? David Cameron was 5-2 on, and Ed Miliband was 9-4. Now, it's not because I necessarily think that Ed Miliband will be the Prime Minister on the 1st of June, but he's certainly a lot better than a 9-4 shot. Okay? And if it's looking for betting value, to me, that made good sense. I noticed that the following morning, the odds have been reduced to 7-4, and it wasn't the weight of Tom money, that's for sure. But nonetheless, you know, clearly overpriced. What about Labour's strategy then? Well, having good qualitative focus groups discussing this at the BBC with different Labour candidates who were very honest and off the record, the Ed Miliband problem, according to the Labour's candidates, they were quite frank. They acknowledged, yes, there is an Ed problem on the doorstep. But what they argue is that people are saying, yeah, we don't particularly rate him as a potential Prime Minister, but it's not going to stop us voting Labour. And that is not necessarily reflected in the polls, because if you pose that question, looking at the YouGov survey evidence, where they say, which would you prefer, a Conservative-led government under David Cameron, or a Labour-led government under Ed Miliband, when you introduce the names to it, the Conservatives are 10 points ahead on YouGov's evidence from that. So perhaps amongst the broader electorate, but amongst Labour's supporters at least, Ed Miliband is not putting off their support. The second point to make about Labour's campaign is that unusually the two tax rises that they're promising are actually popular. Not many parties can go into an election offering popular tax rises, but the mansion tax commands popular support if you look at the survey evidence. And restoring the 50 pence in the pound top rate for tax, again, the survey evidence suggests that there is electoral support for that. The third point about Labour is that there is a low-hanging fruit of the Lib Dem vote, which can be easily eroded. I actually think the Lib Dem vote will hold up pretty well against the Conservatives, particularly in the north, places like Southport, Cheadle, Hazel Grove. I expect the Lib Dems to retain those seats. Labour's going to wipe out the Lib Dems by and large here in the north. So it's perfectly possible that what may happen is that Labour may win with fewer seats than they had in 1979 when they lost to Margaret Thatcher. That's potentially. The other key point to make about this is that obviously that Labour have more potential bedfellows, which leads us on to Northern Ireland, because clearly the Conservatives are short of fellow supporters. The DUP have been very sensible in Northern Ireland, leading into the Northern Ireland study, in keeping themselves open for business with either party. And that leads us into the Northern Ireland election survey. First of all, just to say, the main thrust of it is 1,500 post-election interviews. We're gambling on people remembering by the 29th of May who they voted for. That's the last day that the research must be completed. It was piloted last week. I can exclusively reveal that Protestant Sandy Road will be voting for different parties than Catholic Falls Road, having piloted it last week. We've got 100 sampling points across Northern Ireland for this survey. Okay. I won't bore you with all details working with social market research about waiting for the obviously sensitive demographics of Northern Ireland, and thanks to the sponsors, the ESRC, £200,000 to do it, and thanks to the anonymous referees, some of whom are in this room, possibly. Okay. The current state of play in Northern Ireland. The DUP, currently the fourth largest parliamentary party, a statistic that sometimes tends to be overlooked. Obviously they're going to slip to fifth largest parliamentary party unless the Lib Dems really do implode. Oops, go back to that. And I expect the DUP to actually increase their parliamentary representation at this election. Sinn Féin, there's been some speculation about them taking their seats, taking an oath of allegiance to a British monarch. It'd be very difficult for Sinn Féin to do that in the short term. Senior Sinn Féin officials have said to me it's no longer a fundamental Republican principle that we don't take an oath of allegiance, it's purely that there is no strategic or tactical value. Okay? So the door is open, the door is at least ajar, but it would need a special Ardèche, a special conference of Sinn Féin and a two-thirds majority of the party to change that rule. And Adams and McGuinness are not sufficiently convinced that they would have the votes to do it at present, which is on the cards. And you'll notice there that I forecast that Alliance will lose their solitary seat. And that really is a key contest. Belfast East is a key contest within Northern Ireland. It was an embarrassment for the DUP to lose their leader, Peter Robinson, in 2010. He lost it amid circumstances. Switch family Robinson, as they were being dubbed, lots of allegations about personal issues. It's quite a bit of contest in lots of ways, Belfast East. Peter Robinson has been targeting Alliance with his speeches. A namesake, no relation, Gavin Robinson is standing for the DUP there. The no love lost at all between the DUP and the centrist Alliance Party. If you think of one of Peter Robinson's most recent speeches, I think it was the last DUP party conference in the autumn, where he described the Alliance as the parade-stopping, flag-lowering, gay marriage-supporting Alliance Party. Which shows the level of animosity. And for Alliance, it's been a difficult time. They've had their offices firebombed in East Belfast as a consequence of those flag protests a couple of years ago. I'd expect the DUP to take it. The demographics are very much in favour of the DUP. It's a 77% Protestant seat. It was particular circumstances that cost the DUP in 2010, which will not be repeated, I think, in 2015. Okay? There are other marginal contests, as you'll see, but I don't expect substantial change across Northern Ireland. So the question then is, and this is probably one of those very rare times where Northern Ireland is actually interesting for a general election, because the DUP may potentially be balance of power holders. Most people would normally switch off when the Northern Ireland results come in, even on those BBC Parliament channel reruns. That's the bit when we finally give up when we get to the Northern Ireland results. What does the DUP want then? Well, first of all, they've been sensible in saying they're open for business. The DUP historically right of centre on constitutional issues, but cognizant of their working class loyalist support, left of centre on economic issues. What would they want? Well, more money. The problem with that for the DUP is that the financial settlement for Northern Ireland has been agreed for the next 10 years in the Stormont House Agreement, agreed just before Christmas. It's difficult to completely pick that apart within the space of a few months. So we're talking about more money in terms of pet projects rather than a completely revamped financial settlement for Northern Ireland. The DUP shopping list is also pretty transparent in terms of defence spending, minimum 2% of GDP, early EU referendum, strong border controls. The bedroom tax has never been extended to Northern Ireland, and the DUP is strongly opposed to it. And then there's the controversial stuff, which Nigel does, as DUP parliamentary leader, does not talk about in great detail. And that is, whereas the DUP wants very much Westminster to butt in Northern Ireland in terms of extra cash, it very much wants Westminster to butt out in terms of the DUP's social conservatism. The DUP, as part of the St Andrews Agreement of 2006, when they did the extraordinary deal with Sinn Féin, the DUP insist that part of the reason they did that was because they were otherwise direct rule would have meant the imposition, the extension of the 1967 Abortion Act over here to Northern Ireland, and no veto over same-sex marriage. These things matter to the DUP. They've blocked same-sex marriage 3 times in the last 4 years in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and they'll be insistent upon their veto over it. These things matter to DUP members. So it's a case of butting in and butting out. In terms of the DUP's membership, we did a membership survey over the last couple of years. There's no doubt where the loyalties, or the preferences I should say, of the DUP members would lie. it's towards the Conservative Party by 7-1 over Labour. Okay? So it's still more likely that a DUP deal with the Conservatives. The Conservatives need the DUP, they haven't got other bedfellows. The Conservatives are pretty desperate for DUP support potentially after the election. The price, well, a lot of what the DUP want really is in line with what the Conservatives want, and no party is going to interfere in the vetoes that the DUP are continuing to demand. So that's the situation in Northern Ireland. Who knows, like I say, it's the first time perhaps that Northern Ireland has been of interest. If you think that these things don't matter to DUP members in terms of the vetoes, here's some data from the DUP membership. Some of the propositions we put: homosexuality is wrong. 2/3 of DUP members believe it's wrong. And, this is a party where we also asked how much, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much influence should faith in church have upon your party, and they scaled it at 7.3 out of 10, which is pretty high. And the same on abortion, strong opposition to its legalisation. So there's the DUP shopping list, there's the position in respect of Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And now we move to Meryl Kenny from Leicester, who's going to talk to us about gender in the election.
Okay, so you can hear me all right? Yeah? Okay, so as Alfred said, I'm going to talk about what the kind of projected rewriting of the political landscape might mean for women, and specifically for women's representation. The first thing to do, I think, is to briefly flash back to the 2010 general election, which in many ways was a favourable opportunity structure for women's political representation in the UK. The issue was politically salient, parties were publicly competing over the issue, Labour was continuing its commitment to all women shortlists, the Conservatives and David Cameron had made an effort to reform Conservative selection processes. The Speaker's Conference on Parliamentary Representation had put the issue higher up the agenda, and of course the expenses scandal opened up a lot of seats. But despite this kind of window of opportunity that you have, the result is disappointing. The percentage of women in the House of Commons in 2010 increased only by a very small margin, so it rose from just under 20% to 22%, largely again due to Labour's continued use of all-women shortlist and the party's placement of women in retirement or target seats. And one of the figures that's frequently been cited here is that the number of male MPs elected in 2010 outnumbers the total number of female MPs ever elected to the House of Commons. And this is an image that's been going around Twitter for the last couple of weeks about sections of the UK that have never returned an MP who's not a white male. In 2015, in contrast, I think the issue of women's political representation hasn't been as prominent an issue. It hasn't been an issue that parties have really competed over. Scotland is a possible exception to that statement, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But predictions for women's representation suggest that in spite of this, that we may see some gains here. And the Electoral Reform Society's recent report, issued just a few weeks ago, predicted 192 female MPs in the House of Commons. So that would be around 29.5%. A record high, still, of course, well short of 50-50, but a figure around 30%, which a lot of international organizations, institutions, see as a kind of critical threshold necessary for substantial change. A premise that is hugely problematic, but I'm not going to get into that here. And other predictions of the last week or so have come in around that same kind of percentage, 29-30%. So So again, a big rise from 22 or 22.6, where we are kind of now. And this is again largely due to Labour. Right? Labour will once again have the highest number of women MPs. We can say this with certainty, one of the few things with certainty that we can say in this election. And Labour is likely, as a direct result, again, of the use of all women shortlists in retirement and key target seats, to see a parliamentary party that is more than 40% female. And the more marginals they win, the better their gender representation will likely be. The Greens, unsurprisingly, also do well in terms of selecting female candidates. At last count, just under 40%, but of course are not expected to gain seats in May, so won't make a dent into the overall numbers. The interesting story here, I think, is the SNP. So 36% of its candidates are women. That's a significant increase from its proportions in 2010. If recent dramatic polls prove accurate and the SNP do win more than 50 seats at Westminster, this could potentially result in a kind of record high of 30% or more female Scottish SNP MPs, which is compared to around 22% in 2010. Why is that significant? It's significant, first of all, because Scotland has historically had a relatively poor record on women's representation in the House of Commons compared to overall figures. And second, it signals a potential step change for a party that has traditionally been seen to have a kind of problem with women. And we see that kind of rhetoric come up around the gender gap and support for independence. But I think in terms of this change, crucially, it's been change that we've seen from the top. So from Nicola Sturgeon, who has made powerful statements about women's representation, including appointing a gender equal cabinet, a 50-50 cabinet, publicly supporting the cross-party civil society campaign, Women 50-50, and of course, crucially on Sunday, the SNP party conference backed the ability to set all women shortlists and use other gender balancing mechanisms for future selections. Though while that is a significant achievement, given significant resistance within the party, I think we have to wait and see what happens once we get to the implementation phase. So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they would say. The Conservatives, meanwhile, are projected to have somewhere around 19 to 20% women MPs, up from 16%. The Lib Dems, who knows, are projected most recently to have 1 female MP at most, down from 7. UKIP, which has unsurprisingly selected the lowest number of female candidates amongst all parties. At one point, a newspaper report highlighted that the party had selected more men named Dave or Steve than it had women. He is not currently projected to have any women MPs. But thinking beyond women's representation, which again arguably hasn't received a lot of attention in the run-up to the election, we should also talk about women voters, which has received a lot of attention. And most notably the now notorious Labour pink bus, or cerise, magenta, however you should want to describe it, which was launched to go out to constituencies and talk to women voters at their kitchen tables. Make of that what you will. There's also been a lot of coverage of David Cameron's and the Conservative Party's, again, perceived women problems, their problems in appealing to or keeping the support of women voters. And I should plug here that the PSA did a Google Hangout last week with various academics and activists talking about women in voting in the run-up to the general election. I still don't understand entirely what a Google Hangout is, but apparently you can watch it on YouTube, so you should do that. But also I want to refer here to the work of Rosie Campbell, who I think has very effectively critiqued this notion that there are missing women voters out there, that women are less likely to vote in the UK than men. And Rosie's work, I think, highlights that women may be less interested in formal politics than men. And for anyone who watched Inside the Commons last month, I think we could see some reasons why. But she also highlights that there is little convincing evidence that significantly fewer women than men have voted in recent general elections. In 2010, highlights the gender gap in self-reported or validated voter turnout in the British election study was just 1%. And we also don't see a gender gap similar to what you see in the US, where the Democrats get more support from women than men. There was a long-standing pro-conservative traditional gender gap in British politics, which closed in the 1990s, subsequently challenged by Tony Blair and New Labour. But subsequently in 2010, Cameron and the Conservatives were able to catch up on some of those votes. and indeed, as we highlighted earlier, explicitly appeal to women. I'm part of an ESRC seminar series on feminising politics in the UK, which kicked off a few weeks ago, and one of the questions that was raised at the first seminar was whether we might see a kind of re-emergence of a modern gender gap in voting in 2015, with women potentially to the left of men. And I think there's some very interesting work that Sarah Childs and Paul Webb and subsequently Sarah and Rosie have done on Conservative Women Party members and subsequently Conservative women voters, which does indicate that Conservative women are to the left of men in terms of tax and spend issues in particular, and that they're less in favour of cuts than men. So if a gender gap was going to emerge, in many ways you might think it would be this election, given in particular the extent to which women have been disproportionately affected by the coalition's austerity measures and cuts. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that this issue has been sufficiently politicised in the election campaign to make a difference, or a significant difference in that respect. The last thing I wanted to mention before I wrap up is media coverage of female politicians. I'm thinking here of work by Heather Savini, Deirdre O'Neill, and also others, many of who presented at this conference, looking at media coverage of women MPs, which suggests that women MPs and politicians are much more likely to get negative coverage than their male counterparts, that the content of that coverage is often highly sexualized, that it reduces women to their body parts or their shoes in some cases, or that it positions women as sexual objects. And I wanted to just point to two recent examples of the recent treatment of Nicola Sturgeon in particular. We are all by now aware of the Conservative Party ad with Ed Miliband and Alex Salmond's Pocket, which renders the actual current female First Minister of Scotland invisible, but this was the cartoon run in the Daily Mail in response to that of Ed Miliband down on the left there in Nicola Sturgeon's cleavage. And here is the Sun spread on the right here, which didn't run north of the border, only ran in select markets, of Nicola Sturgeon in a tartan bikini doing a Miley Cyrus pose, which strikes the eye, but also at the bottom here you have 4 reasons to be fearful, and you have 4 SNP candidates. And second from the right is Tasmina Sheikh, who is the SNP women's officer. That picture is not Tasmina Sheikh. That is another ethnic minority woman entirely, whose picture has been photoshopped into that spread. So some interesting and kind of appalling things going on there. So to wrap up, I think regardless of the outcome, regardless of whether we reach the kind of projected 30% figure of women in the House of Commons after 7th of May, we still obviously have a significant distance to travel before equal representation at Westminster becomes a realistic prospect. The ERS's report, again, which makes that 30% prediction, suggests that the way forward is electoral reform. Right? If we move to proportional representation, everything will be okay. Right? And this reflects, I think, their continuing reluctance to engage with the Q word, quotas. And it's also not supported by the evidence in the UK or comparatively. PR electoral systems may facilitate, but certainly do not guarantee increases in women's political presence. What the global evidence does point to is a more immediate solution. And again, here I'm going to use the Q word, the use of gender quotas. Quotas that are well designed, that are properly implemented, are one of the most effective ways of ensuring significant increases in women's numerical representation. The problem in the UK, which we can see in these candidate selection figures, also which we will see once the results are called, is that in the UK, while the use of quotas has been effective, it has also been one-sided. So it's been specific to the Labour Party, for the large part. The wider debate over quotas has been marginal, in that it has largely taken place within the parties, and only to any effect really within Labour. It has been parochial and has been non-scientific, in that it has refused to engage with or follow the global evidence. And it's been ideological, in that it fails to acknowledge that gender matters to democracy. So Labour continues to prop up the numbers. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems continue to raise the possibility of introducing gender quotas sometime down the road, only not to follow through. A few weeks ago on Women's Hour, if you heard it, Nick Clegg suddenly came to the realization that the Lib Dems might be too male and pale. Last year, he said that he would consider introducing all-women shortlists in the run-up to 2020. Why not 2015? We don't know, but again, this idea of in the future, we will think about these things. In the last few years, there's been a real push also in reports from the Speakers' Conference, from the APPG Women in Parliament report, the Sex and Power report, and so on, for legislative quotas. So quotas mandated through electoral law. And I think certainly the evidence from the UK suggests that without system-wide statutory quotas, women's representation remains contingent upon party will or upon individual champions. What I worry is that if we hit the 30% threshold or get close to it after May, that these debates and wider reform agendas will be effectively neutered, that we will see a kind of sense of complacency, particularly I think arguably among the Conservative Party, but not exclusively, and that gains made in this general election may fall or stall in subsequent elections. So we'll stop there.
Thank you very much.